Welcome to another conversation in People in Fundraising. This podcast features interviews with nonprofit professionals who discuss their career journeys, lessons learned, and enthusiasm for working in fundraising. And here's your host, the founder of People in Fundraising, Tim Wilson.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the People in Fundraising Professional Conversations series. My primary goal for this nonprofit webcast is to provide a space for nonprofit professionals to share part of their career and sort of a living history project. And today, I'm really excited to welcome Andy McMahon to our program. Hello, Andy.
Hey, Tim. How's it going?
It's going well. It's nice to talk to a fellow Massachusetts kid. So
yeah, I mean, we're everywhere, but yeah, here we are.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you wanting to be a guest on the program today. Andy sorry.
No, go ahead.
Andy is currently the lead data and prospect analyst at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. So, Andy, you are the first guest to represent our nation's capital in this series. So thank you again.
Yeah, and there's so many more, great folks in the DC region involved with prospecting. So I think you should see who else you can bring on. And I should also mention I'm doing this interview just in my personal capacity. So any opinions, anything I share are mine alone.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. Well said. Andy, I'd love to hear, first of all, maybe a little bit about your Bay State upbringing and how you entered the nonprofit profession, please.
Yeah, for sure. So I grew up in a town north of Danvers. North of Boston. It's called Danvers.
Yep.
And so one of the things that I often mention to people, so it's usually sort of more well known by its original name, which was Salem Village.
Okay.
Yeah. So they changed the name for pretty obvious reasons. And so it sort of does intersect with how I really started to the first encounter philanthropy. So there's another person that grew up in Boston who not really a household name. His name is George Peabody, and he ended up becoming sort of one of the prominent early philanthropists, really, the wave before Carnegie and Rockefeller. And so one of the ways that his philanthropy impacted me is the public library, which we used to go to a lot. It's still called the Peabody Institute, and there's sort of all of this recognition. And I remember, like, as a little kid, sort of going and seeing and reading the marble inscriptions, and it sort of made an impression on me as far as and I guess it didn't really sink in until quite a bit later, but seeing like this is one version of successful philanthropy, because it's a pretty small library, but it's lasted since he founded it in 1854, and it sort of evolved and all of that, but sort of the impact that it's had has generations of people in the town have been able to go there. So that's one thing that sort of stuck with me from my upbringing, seeing that even though it's a smaller operation, it's philanthropy that sort of sticks with you.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and so I did go to college out of state. I went to Carleton College in Minnesota, and it's a liberal arts college, and so I was very focused on philosophy courses. So I took quite a few philosophy courses, and I think sometimes when you are of a certain age, you can think narrowly. So I was thinking to myself, I'm a philosophy major, so that might make sense as my ultimate profession. So I was sort of taking that idea very seriously. And I remember a lot of the conversations that I had with, professors and other folks about, like, how do you enter the field? And the advice that I got, I can still remember it. It was, you want to go to a good graduate program, and then, if you're lucky, you'll get a job. Which really sounds super encouraging. And then but then there was also sort of a sense from them that, it would all work out, which is would be, I mean, to me at least, I think quite the leap of faith. And I think one day I can remember talking to an alum who was a few years older than me, who was working on a philosophy PhD at this where I thought I really wanted to go, which is the University of Pittsburgh. And I remember talking to him, and I felt like I got this whole different perspective on what it would really be like, because he was still doing his degree. And I could sort of tell, he was still very much figuring things out, even though he was ostensibly, almost done, almost ready to finish the program. And it sort of triggered in me thinking about, okay, what would I really be doing if I was doing that job? Would I be able to really see myself through? And it led to a bit of a crisis, because I was thinking so narrowly about, like, okay, I'm training, I'm getting a degree in philosophy, that's training me for this. And what ended up pushing me toward fundraising, I think this wasn't the only reason, but one of the factors is definitely that is so different from what I was trying to do with philosophy. Because if you're having lots of abstract discussions, it can feel very disconnected from any real world consequences. But when you're fundraising, either you get the funds and your programs are okay, or they're not. So it was kind of a different sort of leap, because I felt like, I don't really know anything about this, but I'm pretty sure I'm not going to go the graduate school route. So let me try this. So that's really that's really the story of how I ended up doing it. And I didn't really know what it would be like at all. But I still remember some of my, when I was first doing internships, one of the things I hadn't really expected was, like, the diversity of things that I'd be doing, because these were very small organizations. And I basically, the only thing I didn't do, I mean, obviously I'm exaggerating a little bit, but I basically did everything short of asking for money.
Right. Awesome.
And that was sort of, it was a fun learning experience, and how it would really push you to take on new things that you didn't think you'd be doing. So that's the short answer of how I ended up in the field. And then since then, it's been more of a focus on data, but that sort of came later.
Okay. So Andy, I thank you for that walk through how you really, from a young age, were exposed to philanthropy, and how that helped influence decisions later in life. I would love to hear a little bit, before we dive into the data analysis piece, the specificity of that. You mentioned being exposed to and having responsibility in a lot of areas, fundraising, early in your career. Was it a combination of skill set or institutional fit that was like, I don't want to perhaps go this route in fundraising. I want to maybe channel my skills, my personality, the values of the organization in this area?
Right. Yeah, I think so. I think that was sort of a gradual process. And I think I think that sometimes people talk about the small shop mentality, where it's like, this needs to get done. Like, somebody has to do the invoices.
Right.
Somebody has to figure out, like, is our budget okay? And sometimes even more fundamental things, like, I think one of the first places I interned, they weren't even sure at first if we had filed the right paperwork to register as, like, that we could still fundraise in this state. So that was that was kind of not something I thought I'd be doing. Right. And then, the experience can change quite a bit when you are, when you move on to some place where there's more staff and sort of, you have folks that are always thinking about that kind of thing, so it's not going to come up.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that's where the specialization sort of came in. And I think it's also, I didn't really realize it at first, but I think it does sort of suit me better to be working with data. And that's sort of not how I was thinking about things at all in college, because I'm not a math person.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of folks, we sometimes think of it that way, that working with data and even data science is like being a statistician.
Right.
And there are just so many differences. And even I've heard, maybe you've heard people say this, but I really have come to believe it, that you can take someone who's, a savant, like the best model builder mathematician in the world, but if they don't have like the understanding of the data, there's severe limits on what they'd be able to do for you. I mean,
sure.
Have you heard people do that as well?
Yeah, I've heard the one who comes to mind right away is Marianne Pelletier at Stoppel Analytics, where she talked about in trainings and webinars, the data tell a story. So you need the person to interpret the data, know the audience that will hear the story, and walk away with an understanding of what the data is telling us.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Well put, yeah. And so, Andy, I am imagining I get the philosophy, the curiosity with prospect research. So when did, in contrasting that with the data component, so when did that kind of convergence occur, and you would, maybe felt like, oh, it's okay to have had that philosophy, curiosity, I can channel it into prospect research and finding out about donors, but I'm also really interested in developing proficiency with the data. So talk with us about that part of the journey, please.
Right, for sure. So I think I eventually sort of started to do prospecting and pipeline management, and sometimes event bios. I mean, I'm sure you've done it all, I'm sure. And I guess it was really working with the pipeline management. When I really started to do that at Share Our Strength. I guess the connection to data sort of at a bigger scale was, I guess, the understanding. It started to dawn on me, like the tasks that we were doing, we could get better results with a bigger picture. So it's sort of like that generalizing, okay, like we're identifying these prospects, we're trying to we're trying to project our revenue for next year. We're trying to sort people by qualification, and then sort of realizing, we can generalize this. And I know that, and obviously I'm not the first person to think that way. There's so much out there that I just wasn't even tuned into about people already thinking that way. But that was sort of the motivation. It was sort of like going up the ladder and realizing, wait, like we can probably do this better, but in order to do so, I've got to start to think in new ways, and not be so afraid of data anymore, and like see what can we actually do. And then I ended up so I think, and another moment that I really remember is, so tell me if you've had this experience too. Sometimes if you try to load too much data into your spreadsheet, you'll eventually reach the end, and you can just sort of like see that there's just like a cliff. They've expanded it. I think these days it's something like 1.2 million rows or something like that. I can't even remember what I was trying to look at, but I was like, wow, I've never seen that before. And that's what pushed me to start to try to use different software that would be able to handle that sort of thing.
Mm.
Because I still do use Excel, all the time to share stuff because it's so easy and everybody, everybody's going to be able to open a spreadsheet and see this and that.
Sure.
Yeah, but that was another moment where it sort of pushed me into, okay, maybe I should be working in different software. And that's an R. So the R programming language was what I eventually started to do. And it's like that's what opened up a lot of other possibilities. And yeah, and just as a plug for R, like one of the great things about it is it's totally free.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fantastic. And I just find that part of your career journey fascinating. And I wondered, Andy, you were there. So I know you've been involved with the Apra D.C.
Yes.
chapter, the prospect development chapter. So as you were looking to build out your skill set, and you mentioned specialization,
Right.
were there resources such as within the chapter or within the greater Apra community or trainings that you look back on and say that was really helpful
Right.
for me?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, I mean, it's been a little bit now, but I did end up doing so I know Apra still does it, just like the new researcher training.
Oh yeah.
And I think what was really helpful for me about that is I was doing research, but sort of in my own corner and thinking about it in my own way, and being able to hear more from, people working at all sort of different places, and also a little bit of the history. And I think I still have the notes from it. And it's like, look, here are some of the tried and true methods of how we do this. And even though it was like a really big picture, I think that was definitely something that was helpful for me. And then I guess, so something else that I think has been helpful, and this doesn't always work out super well, but trying to look into, there are lots of, so for some reason, like business schools, sometimes when they're doing like case studies and research, like charitable giving is something that they like to focus on, and some people working in econ as well. And having looked, I remember for a while looking at some of the research and seeing what I could find and seeing like, oh, could we apply this? And oftentimes we couldn't, but it would sort of give me ideas about, what could we do? And then, so I think as far as a way of thinking about it, what's been most helpful for me is, obviously we're working as fundraisers. There are so many unique things about it that you're not going to see in any industry, but that we can also maybe learn things from, business analysis, where they're trying to predict, how many pizzas is this person going to buy? So sort of that sort of framework, where we start somewhere that's totally different and see if we can bring it back. Because and then I know I'm sure we'll talk about it more a little later. I think one thing that's really interesting about AI and fundraising is all of the applications were developed for, very different settings than our world.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think I think that curiosity and the applying even outside circumstances, outside research to the work that we do, specifically in prospect development and with data, but expanding that a little bit more, with our frontline fundraising teams and such, I've felt that's really a creative outlet for me. And getting back to what you talked about with data and stories, it's like, how can I use this Major League Baseball analogy to get across some fundraising trends that I see within our own shop?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I think those stories really can help. I just wonder, like, in your general experience over your career, how have gift officers, frontline staff, perhaps advancement services, how have they approached these big data conversations that you've had with them?
Right. Yeah, that's a really good question. I can I can think back and I feel like, I mean, this isn't, it's not true that there aren't sort of different major gift offer personalities, but I feel like I'm thinking back to the ones I worked with at Share Our Strength, and just there's always a different approach. It's like they've all got their own personalities.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I've really seen the gamut, between folks that are very focused on, the practical day-to-day. I'm going to go out here, I'm going to do my meetings. And I think I do also see, and I'm thinking back to a few that were very involved in like exactly what you're talking about. Like, show me that data. I want to dig into it.
Yeah.
The level that they're, exploring sort of as a parallel track. They're trying to digest everything they can about, what's big data. Because I mean, but these days that's almost like the big data craze was, it's still with us, but it's not really front and center like it used to be.
Yeah. Interesting. I would love to pivot, Andy, and talk about, you mentioned artificial intelligence. And one thing I really appreciate about you specifically and other people that I've either had on the program or will have on as guests is just the engagement on LinkedIn to share ideas and maybe, gently prod people to think a little bit differently. Certainly sharing best practices.
Sure.
So I did a quick training in my own office at Weber State about artificial intelligence, and it was very high level, and it was more about kind of contextualizing for the fundraisers. I heard this term in a New York Times article that right now it's mostly a land grab of public opinion about what AI is and will do.
Sure.
And again, kind of here are like the big picture perhaps implications, but let's bring it down to the work we do in nonprofits.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, for example, you commented recently on LinkedIn about sort of the distinguishing terms that I think lots of people right now are gravitating to artificial intelligence as this big catch-all. And I liked how you put it, that in your work, you're trying to create this culture of using terms like predictive model and generative model as a way to help your staff get perhaps a better handle on what you're doing with big data.
Yeah, and I think, so this is something else I'm thinking back to a few jobs ago, but I remember us approaching predictive modeling. Like we had a contractor that was going to help with predictive modeling. And I remember I could sort of, at that time, I hadn't really done nearly as much with data as I have now, but I could sort of tell that there was something about the terminology predictive modeling that would sort of invite people to think that it's like a crystal ball almost. I mean, I'm exaggerating quite a bit, but yeah, and it's kind of interesting, like when I've done especially some of my explorations with predictive modeling that haven't been work centered, seeing it can be kind of a misnomer because a lot of them don't predict much at all. It's just kind of a dud. But I think it's really difficult because, I mean, you can definitely understand the vendors want to communicate like this is exciting and it's new, and it's making certain things successful that haven't been around before. There's also such a history to artificial intelligence that has been sort of, I guess it never really was in popular culture other than maybe through sci-fi.
Right.
But there's some, like the real like founding era was the 1950s, which is like kind of funny to think about. If you think about the guys with like punch cards and these gigantic, the gigantic computers.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, and the guy's name was Arthur Samuel. Like, so one of the first big breakthroughs was getting one of those computers to like play checkers competently.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
and I don't even think he could, the program could like necessarily beat everybody, but the fact that it could even, sort of hold its own, like that was the really big advance.
Oh,
But it's
sure.
sort of funny to look back. There were all of these predictions, or like in the 60s and 70s, about, within 10 years, we're going to have our AI that can do anything a person can do.
Right.
And it's, yeah, and I'm definitely not saying that, things are changing, like especially in our field. So it's not like we're not advancing, but
Yeah.
it's sort of fun sometimes to go back and look at what people say in the moment and how they're sort of, they can see something is happening, but as far as pinning it down, it can be really difficult. And I also like, so Emory has a fun database I recently found, which is
Mm,
people in like the really early internet era, right when it was breaking through, like
mm.
94, 95, 96, like making these predictions about how society would change. And
Yeah.
it's really fun to look back at, because there's so many things where it's like, wow, you were right about that.
Right.
And then sometimes there are these off the wall things like, fax machines are still better, like all of that. Yeah, but I mean, I think that it is a lot of, I mean, it is fun to sort of imagine where we could be going next.
Yeah.
But it's also one of the difficult things. So I wish there was a good way to um, better explain sort of how these models are built, because I'm definitely not a real expert, so to speak. Like, I'm not doing these things and bringing them to market. I think some of the aspects of what they're really doing, I think sometimes get masked,
Yeah.
partly because it's such a slick product.
Sure. Yeah.
And like the effect of being able to chat with it is sort of overwhelming. So I'm
Right.
sure you've seen some of the earlier versions, like the GPT-2 and 1.
Mm. I haven't
Um,
seen those now.
yeah, there's a link I can send you where you can sort of play around with it. And what's so different about it is the whole function where you could give it instructions and it could run with it. They
Yeah.
hadn't been able to implement that yet. So all you could do is start writing something, and then it would give you like the next words one by one. So it felt much more like,
Interesting. Yeah.
yeah. So it felt much more like, being in Gmail or something, where you're writing and it's like
Yeah.
this, and this, and this. And
Yeah.
that's one thing that I'm starting to think about a little bit, that sort of the user experience really matters a lot. Like, whether it feels like there's something on the other side versus like, I feel like, I mean, this is how I feel when I'm on my smartphone, like you're typing and it's auto correcting. I never really get the sense that there's somebody on the other side.
Right. Yeah. That's an interesting example to conclude with, because as you were talking, Andy, I was reminded, I don't know if it was John McWhorter or
Oh yeah.
Farhad Manjoo from the New York Times, or maybe it's someone else in the New York Times, saying like, one way to, if people are feeling anxious or apprehensive about artificial intelligence, one small step they can take is to not go with the autocorrect, the auto next suggestion on their phones and Gmail. And I thought that's nice advice, but I think the horse has left the barn. Like, most people are still
Oh,
going to do
absolutely.
that. You know,
Yeah.
like
Yeah,
I think of
exactly.
my daughters, like they're not going to,
Right.
take the time to say, no, I don't mean this. I
Right.
don't need the suggestions.
Right. Yeah. I think that's a good point. Like, there's a lot of ways where it's become second nature. Like, also, if you're trying to drive from point A to point B, it would be, maybe there are folks out there that, I mean, I know there are a few folks out there that still just pull out their maps, but
Right.
Yeah, but it's interesting because we don't think of it that way, right? Like it's just sort of it's a more of a convenience almost.
Yes, exactly. That's a good way to think about it. And I would love to hear if you've had experience thinking through, how to get away from the hype of artificial intelligence, whether that's um, in your current work situation or even maybe outside of work,
Mm-hmm.
with that interest you have in the application of it. Just talk with me about how you feel those conversations go to kind of set more realistic aspirations and not be such a hype about artificial intelligence.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, I mean, how I've been thinking about it, and especially with, um, sometimes working through some of these models on the side, without work data. I think one thing that's been really helpful is trying to understand the different types of models and what they can do. And obviously, like, we're not going to be necessarily under the hood doing groundbreaking work, but sort of
Yeah.
understanding that. And I think in BWF, I went to one of their presentations yesterday, actually, and they were really good about this, separating out what they're calling predictive AI from the generative AI. I think there have been a few cases of folks sort of mixing them together, but thinking about what type of AI is the right tool and like what the business goal is. I think I do think people are trying to do that, but sometimes we need to do it a bit more. So I mean, from one perspective, the capacity ratings and everything, the most definitions of AI I've seen, like, that's AI. And so we've been doing that since the early 90s.
Right.
Yeah. So I think thinking about what sort of problems, and if like we can get as narrow as possible, like what are the really narrowly defined use cases where this might be able to help us? I think that's really the number one takeaway that I'm seeing, and especially when you look at people talking about doing similar AI integrations in different businesses, like that's one of the themes that I'm seeing, because you can, so like with Chat GPT as an example, like I've seen, one thing that you can do is you can create your own Chat GPT that just draws from your own documents. So some organizations are doing that, which is, I think it's a very interesting idea, but you also think about, like, in what cases are you going to need that? Like, there could be some cases, but is that what we need in our world?
Yeah. Yeah. So interesting. I think, and just to give an example of my own world now, a few weeks ago, I emailed the IT team and said, hey, do we have any policy about using Chat GPT? Just general for staff to use it, and B, if staff are permitted to use it, what is the limitation about using? Do I have to use my personal, or can I use my work email account without using even the work data, as you mentioned? Still haven't heard back.
Oh no. Yeah, that's pretty important bunch of questions there. So.
Yeah. So I think, and I feel like you are, further down the field than I am, both with the institution and with your own skill set with artificial intelligence, predictive modeling, generative models. Where do you see a need for, whether that's associations or employers, to get ahead of this evolving technology so that we are keeping expectations realistic and also having that being infused, I mean, with your philosophy background, I imagine ethics are important,
Oh, absolutely.
baked into this as well. So just talk with us about that for a few minutes.
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I think so one thing that I think I've been really heartened by is sort of the number of people, and definitely in our field, and in other fields, that are really making ethical concerns front and center. So that I think that's been really heartening. And obviously it's always something we're going to need to think about when we're doing something like this. It's got to be, at the beginning, not once the horses have left the barn.
Right.
And then, yeah, so as far as making sure that we're, not getting left behind, but also not moving too quickly. Yeah, I think that's a really, really hard one. I think we're going to need to sort of reevaluate at regular intervals because things are moving so fast. And part of it here is, if you even look back to 2019 or 2018, like what was cutting edge then, like even though it's sort of morphed into what we have now, like if you were to ask somebody like, what do you need to do to get ahead? You might have totally different recommendations, and then some of these products are, it's not that they're not around, it's just not front and center like it used to be.
Right.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about the going back to the .com boom as as I sort of mentioned before. And one of the things about that is you think, that's when we got Amazon, and a lot of these companies that now just seem indispensable, for so many people. But then there are all of these other products. I think one of those ones, I mean, I can still remember the sock puppet pets.com.
Oh, yeah.
It seemed like such a great idea, but then, there's a whole bunch of companies like that where it's, they, for whatever reason, they didn't make it. Yeah, so I think that's one of the challenges for us. It's sort of, this is going to be iterative, right? Like it's changing so fast, we're going to have to just keep reassessing with each new wave. And it's almost, and I think a lot of people have said this, right? But like this is the first stage, right? Like it's a flashy, like Chat GPT and all that stuff is flashy, but then in the next inning we're going to have to see, okay, what do we have now, and have things changed at all?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's fascinating to be in the moment now and see these fluctuations, but then also for people that are working with the technology, or even just are generally aware of its already both helpful and pernicious influences in our lives.
For sure.
Fascinating to see what will come next with it.
Right.
Yeah. Well, Andy, this has been such a rich conversation. We're a little more than a half hour into it. With about 5 minutes, I would love to pivot, because I do like to have a little bit of a balance with our guests where we talk about their career journey, maybe some current trends, and you've done that great with artificial intelligence, but also kind of getting the human interest component of the people in fundraising. And so this one, this question comes from a New York Times article last fall entitled "The Little Rituals That Keep Us Going." And when I read it, I found it to be really insightful and applicable to the mission of this podcast series. And they interviewed several people across the country about, a woman gets up and has coffee and she crochets on her porch in the morning, or someone makes a habit of walking their dog at specific times every day as healthy wellness practices that give them a sense of balance. So my question for you, coming from that article, is, what little rituals do you have either to start your day or to wind down your day, so that you do feel like there is a healthy wellness component to your work life and your home life?
Yeah, I mean, that's such an important question. I feel like this is going to make me sound a little bit spoiled. So I live in Northern Virginia, and so my house backs up to a park. It's not really a park; it's more like undeveloped land.
Okay.
But so what's been really sort of restorative for me is so sure just the number of animals that will come in just like right out of the parkland. Um, and we have all these bird feeders that we set up,
Nice.
and seeing just more birds that I've ever seen before, and foxes, deer.
Awesome.
It's almost like a little safari up there, but like being able to sort of slow down and just just take it in a little bit.
Yeah.
That's one thing that's been really restorative. Yeah, and I feel like it's hard to top. I mean, there's lots of other things that are also important,
Yeah.
but there's really no substitute for that. Although I wish that the deer were, sort of a little bit less obnoxious, because we're trying to garden, and they're just like really relentless with certain plants. Like they'll show up and all the buds are gone.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah, but it's just what they do,
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah. Sort of like artificial intelligence. It's what they're programmed to do.
Right.
So.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's awesome. And thank you for sharing that. 'Cause I do think I've tried to do that this summer, and my family jokes with me because I kind of make a big deal about it, whether it's breakfast or the days when I'm working at home, maybe it's lunch or at dinner, I'll just say, "Hey, I'm dining al fresco," and my family's like, "You're obnoxious. Like, just say you're going out on the back deck,
Yeah,
and having a
but
meal."
it's so important, though. I mean, those sorts of things, and I feel like when we're working at home, I feel like it takes on a new meaning.
Yeah.
Yeah, because like a lot of those habits that I think I had in the office, they kind of went up in smoke a little bit, and so we have to find new ways to keep ourselves going.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that must be so cool just to be able to look out and see, the safari in your backyard. So
Yeah.
very nice.
Yeah, and I have new appreciation for woodpeckers and a lot of animals I was never thinking about before.
Yeah, definitely. That's cool. That feels very centering and being more in tune with the world around us. So kudos to you. Well, Andy, thank you so much for your time today. This has been just a fascinating conversation, and I appreciate your comfort level in talking about artificial intelligence, and just being reflective about how you came from the philosophy background and found your space within nonprofit work. But also really cool to hear about George Peabody. Like I did not know that background about him. So thank you
Yeah.
for like a multifaceted, very interesting conversation.
Yeah, and no, I'm just really glad you had me on. I mean, it's been a lot of fun, and for George Peabody, he, the education school at Vanderbilt, and there's a bunch of places in Baltimore. I think there's a ballet school, and I think some things at Johns Hopkins. So he's all over the place, and it's just but it's that one little library that I remember the most.
Yeah, and isn't that amazing that in our formative years, something can take hold and be an influence throughout the lives. So very cool.
Yeah.
Is he by chance connected, or is the Peabody Essex Museum connected to his philanthropy, I should say? Do you know?
So as far as I know, it's not directly. It's just they named the town Peabody after him, and so it's like that's my understanding, but I could be wrong. But you know what? Now that I think about it, we might have to look that one up because, like his I think his family was prominent afterwards. So
sure.
Yeah, we should look into that one. I don't know.
Yes. Well, I will look into that because like you, I'm curious about a lot of things, and
sure.
So thank you so much for your time today, and perhaps in a few years, I make this invitation to some guests that as their careers evolve, or as the roles and responsibilities that a guest does change. In your case, I could see where with artificial intelligence and predictive generative modeling, like there would be a lot more to talk about down the road. So it'd be cool to reconnect.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, and it's a great thought, because then we can be like, okay, here's what we said then, but here's what happened.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, let's plan for that, Andy. Thank you.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Andy, again for your time. You'll be able to find Andy's conversation on my website, peopleinfundraising.com, and on LinkedIn and YouTube. At the end of this summer, I have about a 2-month window now between recordings and when they go live. So, Andy, thank you for your patience. And thank you to our guests for supporting the People in Fundraising webcast. We're halfway through the second season, and I appreciate both the guests who have been on the program as well as the positive responses from our community. So thank you very much, and we'll be back next week with another conversation.